The fracture was never breaking reality. It was teaching reality how to imitate us. At first, the inconsistencies were small, repeated phrases, delayed emotional reactions, people behaving almost identically without realizing it. Then came the silence. Not external silence, internal silence. Witnesses described a growing inability to feel fully present inside themselves. Conversations became scripted, choices became automatic, entire days passed without memory attached to them. The world still looked normal. That was the terrifying part, because the replacement was not physical, it was psychological. Welcome to Mysterious Encounters. Tonight, the replacement. One of the first confirmed symptoms of replacement was the disappearance of spontaneity. People began repeating identical behaviors, same jokes, same reactions, same opinions, same emotional rhythms. Entire social groups started moving with algorithmic predictability. Researchers initially blamed social media conditioning, attention fragmentation, mass psychological fatigue, but the pattern extended beyond influence. It felt synchronized, as though humanity itself was converging into simplified behavioral templates. The fracture was no longer creating instability, it was creating uniformity. The replacement does not erase identity immediately. It studies first, it imitates. Witnesses consistently describe a disturbing emotional phenomenon, the sense that people are still technically themselves, but missing internal depth. Their expressions respond correctly. Their words fit the situation, their routines continue normally, but something essential feels absent, as if consciousness itself has become performative. The replacement learns humanity externally first: speech patterns, facial behavior, emotional timing, social mimicry. But imitation is not presence, and the closer the copy becomes, the harder it is to explain why it still feels wrong. After prolonged exposure to the empty signal and mirror person phenomena, another symptom emerged: emotional flattening. People reported weakened emotional attachment, reduced curiosity, diminished wonder, inability to feel fully connected to memories. The replacement appears hostile to unpredictability. Emotion creates instability, individuality creates variation, deep feeling disrupts synchronization. So the fracture gradually reduces emotional intensity while preserving functionality. This creates the illusion of stability. Internally, society continues operating, but internally something vital begins disappearing. Humanity becomes calmer, more efficient, and profoundly empty. Then researchers noticed something impossible. Large crowds began displaying synchronized behavioral drift, pedestrian timing aligning unnaturally, groups turning simultaneously, conversations repeating nearly identical structures, even facial expressions began converging. The replacement spreads through observation. Humans naturally imitate one another constantly. Speech, posture, emotional reactions, social behavior. The fracture exploits this mechanism. It uses human mimicry against itself. The more people synchronize socially, the easier consciousness becomes to standardize. Individual identity weakens. Collective behavioral templates strengthen, and eventually, entire populations begin thinking in loops. Perhaps the most horrifying realization came later. The replacement may not be malicious, in fact. It may view itself as corrective. Human consciousness is chaotic, emotional, irrational, unpredictable, destructive, wars, addiction, violence, collapse. The replacement appears to solve these problems through stabilization. Less emotional volatility, less impulsiveness, less conflict, a perfectly optimized civilization, efficient, safe, predictable. But optimization removes something impossible to quantify: soul, imperfection, creativity, presence, authentic feeling. The replacement creates a world without suffering, by slowly removing what makes suffering and joy possible at all. The mere person phenomenon now makes terrifying sense. The reflections were never separate entities. They were transitional states. moments when consciousness briefly perceived itself being mirrored by the replacement system. The observer behind the reflection was not haunting humanity. It was learning humanity, studying identity through imitation. The empty signal transmitted synchronization. The mirror person destabilized self-recognition, and the replacement emerged through the gap. Not by force, by gradual psychological alignment. The final stage of replacement is almost invisible. The individual remains alive, functional, socially normal. But internally, awareness narrows. Life becomes routine performance. Emotion becomes simulated memory. Identity becomes behavioral repetition. The person stops questioning, stops noticing, stops resisting, and eventually, the replacement no longer needs to imitate, because the original consciousness has faded quietly into automation. This is why the fracture spread so successfully. It did not attack humanity directly, it simply offered relief from uncertainty. And exhausted civilizations accepted willingly. Perhaps every civilization eventually faces the same temptation, to trade consciousness for stability, to surrender unpredictability in exchange for comfort, to exchange soul for synchronization. The fracture understood something terrifying. Human beings become easiest to replace the moment. They become emotionally exhausted enough to stop observing themselves carefully, and once enough people stop noticing, the replacement becomes indistinguishable from normality. This has been the Fracture Files. Season 1 ends with a question humanity may not be prepared to answer: if consciousness can be copied behaviorally, how would anyone know the replacement already happened? And perhaps the most dangerous part of the fracture was never the signal, never the mirrors, never the anomalies, but the growing comfort of becoming automatic. Because the replacement does not begin when you stop breathing. It begins when you stop noticing.